welcome everyone to the February 2022 edition of the Cerini Connection, where we focus on hot topics impacting your organization and connecting you with leaders in the field. As I said, today we are joined by Simone Sloan, CEO of Your Choice Coach, to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. It's such an important topic on so many levels. So thank you, Simone, for being here and doing this with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
Just real quick before we get started, if anybody does have any questions that they want to ask, if they can please post those questions through the Q&A, that would be great. It makes it easier for me to find them and incorporate them into the conversation today. So Simone, let's get started off with something easy, maybe. Diversity, equity, inclusion, as I said before, is such a hot topic. We're just scratching the surface as to what this will mean for organizations on a go-forward basis. How do you define this whole inclusion, equity, and diversity?
Sure. I think, when you say the hot topic, I just want to give pause because I think it's important to think about those who are living it. And it's not a hot topic, but something that's being lived and experienced on a daily basis, and to really recognize the struggles and joys that come along with it. I think also when you say hot topic, that yes, in terms of corporations being more proactive around that, especially in lieu of the last couple of years, yes, I do see a turn and a difference and a change of energy in terms of not only from the motivation there, but also information that's readily available. But when we talk about inclusion and diversity and what does that all mean, I think that we all have to take an opportunity to think through in terms of what is our true vision around that, right? And defining that for ourselves rather than waiting for someone else to define it for us. And when I think about it from an inclusion perspective, the vision that I have is of air. It's all around us. We need it to survive. It's comprised of a delicate balance of molecules that allows us to be. And it's not necessarily something that we have to think about. It's there and it comes naturally, right? So when we think about what does inclusion mean, that's the question I have for all of you on the line too, in terms of how do you define that for yourselves? What's the vision that you have for this? But when we take a look too, in terms of concretely, what does that mean? We're talking about people feeling welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. But part of that equation also includes trust, consequences, right? Accountability, as well as consistency. And anyhow, one of those pieces of the equation is missing, that's exclusion, right? So we have to kind of think about that.
So how do you change culture? How do you get to a point of making it like air, where it becomes a normal part of what we do and we don't even have to think about it anymore?
Absolutely. Well, you have to think about how we got here, right? Especially in the States. And you're talking about a huge effort of intentionality to be exclusionary. So think about if that effort to be exclusionary took place to get us here, the amount of energy, resources, time, dedication, and intentionality it will take to move us towards more inclusion. So I'm going to say striving, but really, truly the intention, more intentionality around how we communicate, how we lead, how we think, how we interact, how we collaborate. How do we design, and who's in part of that design piece around it? And when you look at it in terms of who's driving, right? In organizations, it comes from the top leads from that perspective. And they're creating the culture. But part of this culture too comes into play around the curiosity and how curious are we in terms of understanding what are the problems with the culture and what needs to change? Do I know how to fix it and who's being impacted? Do I care enough to put the energy forth to make a change? So those are some things where I say, when you think looking at culture, inclusion, diversity, right? It's around getting curious too in terms of what does that current state look like and where are we really trying to go?
Where's the best place to start with this process though? Because I mean, if you're sitting here, it could be a top-down approach, it could be a bottom-up approach. Does it start in the schools when kids are still young, but then that's a long stretch? I mean, where does all of this get started?
I'll take all of it for 100, Alex, but really and truly can. When you think about it too, I've seen it at all parts, bottom up, where the lower ranks are asking for it, demanding it, expecting it. I've also seen top-down initiatives too, in terms of the leaders taking hold and holding accountability and saying, we are going to do this. It's important to us, right? But also showing the behaviors and demonstrating what that looks like, acknowledging and recognizing what that looks like. So that way people know what it is. But what happens too is that, yes, it might come from this top. People are very excited at the bottom, but then you may, depending on how large you have, this middle, frozen middle that maybe, I'm not really interested in this. And so the important piece comes into how do we scale this across the organization so to get the effectiveness so everyone can feel that. And it comes down in terms of looking at it from policies, practices, behaviors, and how do we measure that and incorporate that into our, in terms of maybe performance evaluations, maybe it's around it just in terms of how we abilities that people have on their team. So there are different ways through which this can be created. And yes, starting at younger ages, but when you talk about that from a Gen Z populations, they're expecting this, right? This is their norm. And in terms of what the expectations are versus what is actually being lived, maybe two different things too. So I think understanding what that means at all levels becomes very important.
When you talk about policies, practice, behaviors, let's start with, I guess, the policies part of it, because that's really the big picture, and that's where I think everything starts with the policy component of it, and then the other pieces come from that policy that gets created. How does that policy get created? What sort of policies should we be looking at? Are they formal policies? Are they informal policies? I mean, how does all of that work?
Well, I think what's something that's universal for the companies, right, is an employee handbook if you have one. If you don't have one, get one. But what happens too is just looking at the language of who's actually included. Look, is it binary genders? Or now are you saying he, she, they, right? As part of that. Holidays that are being celebrated. Which holidays are being recognized as part of the handbook? Mental illness, abilities, are they even mentioned as part of this? Veterans. I mean, so the handbook is so telling in terms of how they may be viewing, including or excluding others. That's one place.
Okay. And then in terms of, kind of creating those policies and then implementing them into practice. I mean, obviously that's something that has to happen at an organizational level. And it's got to be, practices that are created organizationally. Are you looking at committees to do this? Are you looking at leadership doing this? Again, who is the right, or what's the right way to kind of create those policies and the practices that come off those policies? Again, is this a leadership sort of thing, top down? Should there be committees, diversified committees that kind of create this? What does that look like? Who effectuates that change?
Absolutely. There's so many particular ways that you can look at this. And I think that when we're talking from a top-down perspective, the leaders are going to have to drive those policies, right, in terms of what's being created. But also you're listening to your people in terms of what they may need as part of those policies and practices, or what may needs to change as part of that. And then you have your people with HR, right, as part of this whole mix. So when it comes to that, it's not only telling what needs to be changed, but also listening to what needs to be changed as part of that. So I say today it's more very organically done, just in terms of getting a pulse of the current state of the culture and what they're really demanding and what they're asking for.
So it's got to be a fluid process, and it needs to continue to be a fluid process. And it needs to be a lot of hopefully listening to get to where you need to be.
Absolutely, because there's some people or some managers who are afraid to make changes because they think it's going to give their employees ideas to do things. And I'm thinking, where are they really coming from? Is it a place of innovation? Is it a place of growth, or a place of fear, right? Because usually when you equip your employees with tools, you're empowering them to be responsible in a different way. And you're giving a level of trust to that exists within that space. So that also informs what the culture might be. Am I safe to be in this culture? Can I speak up and challenge ideas, right? Because people say, oh, we have an open door, not open door these days, but you know what I mean? So where you can share your ideas, but then when arms get folded nonverbal communications are telling otherwise, you're telling me I'm not really safe to really share my true ideas and thoughts. So really thinking through, again, what is the current state of your culture? And then where are you really trying to go in terms of developing a diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, right? Because you want to make sure that you are incorporating and designing it for all and not just maybe for a few.
So how do you go about creating that strategy? How do you go about putting the pieces together effectively to get to a point where, and I don't know that we're ever going to reach where we want to be, or at least probably not in my lifetime. But how do we start that path to where we need to get to?
Absolutely. Well, you're looking at three pillars, right? When you think about it, you're looking from the foundational elements. I always start with culture because that drives your strategy, your values, right? What you believe, as well as in terms of leadership. And that's important. But then also springing out too, you have your external communications to your constituents, your customers, right? The communities in which you serve. And what does that really look like in terms of engagement with them currently today? Right? And the emerging demographics that might be evolving for tomorrow. Internally, also in terms of how you're treating your people, because yes, everyone wants to spring something up. It's Black History Month, let's put up, the social media. Pride Month, let's put something up. But then what's happening on those day-to-day moments when those period of time has passed? How are you interacting and engaging with your employees from that perspective? And so that becomes important from a talent management process to really understand what is it that we are, how are we treating them, onboarding them, recruiting, retaining, right? From all these different perspectives. So there are a myriad of things to look at as you're driving a strategy or even beginning to start one from that perspective.
So when we're talking about, from what you said, so the message has to come within the organization, but it also has to be projected outside of the organization. So when you talked about your handbook before, but then it's also your website, it's also your branding, your communications, your recruiting, so as you said, it's air. It's pretty much everything you do as an organization has to be done with thoughtfulness in terms of how we approach this, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, very thoughtful about it, because you don't want to be performative, right? And you want to be also authentic, because as people are looking at your organization, they're going to your websites and seeing what you're looking at, your posts to see what you're saying and how you're communicating, looking at the leadership teams in terms of what they're comprised of and where people are in the organization. Absolutely. And it becomes very important because they're also going to ask questions in these interviews that not just, hey, what do you think about diversity? And say, you point to your website, but really ask some more meaningful questions to find out, will I be heard? How do we get promoted? What's collaboration look like, right? All these different types of questions that come out of it being included, right, from that perspective. McKinsey had a study where they looked at diversity and inclusion, and they said diversity was off the roots in certain sectors, right, and industries. But then when they looked at inclusion, it didn't have the same percentage of ratings as diversity. So what it really intimates is that, yes, you can go out and say, we need to get diverse hires, but that's not a diversity inclusion strategy. That's a tactic, because part of that equation has to include the equity piece and the inclusion piece to get that full 360 of what you're really benefiting from in this dynamics, right? Because as you know, when you talk about it from the perspective of motivation, people are looking for purpose. And if you don't provide that purpose of what they're being, what's your true differentiation?
This goes back to what you were just talking about. So how much of this stuff at this point is a little forced in terms of, what people are trying to do, and how do you kind of, I don't know. I mean, I feel sometimes, even though I try, maybe it comes across as like I'm trying, and as you said, it shouldn't be like I'm trying. It should be like it's natural. So how do you get to a point where it is natural? It is, and it's not somebody thinking that you're kind of pushing a policy or something through?
Really great question. Everyone's at a different gradient, right? That's what I'm hearing in terms of where people are in their learning curve and learning phase of this. And I think the key thing here is, how are we listening to each other from that perspective? and getting a deeper understanding, which is the empathy piece that comes into play. And what type of questions are you really asking about yourself and your self-reflection, but also in terms of how the other person's lived experiences are coming into place, right? And so if we are so disconnected from, oh, it's something being shoved at me, as opposed to actually understanding the benefit of why this is, that's where the big disconnect comes in. And so the intentionality is to understand, am I coming from a fear perspective? Am I coming from a growth perspective, right? Or just in terms of an advocate perspective. I don't know where you are in this spectrum.
Well, I'm hoping everybody's coming from a growth perspective. I mean, that's where you, hopefully, because that's how you effectuate change, and that's how you get to where this world needs to be.
Absolutely. But you can say that, right? But then your behaviors may be showing your growth, but maybe coming from fear. And it may come out in terms of your behaviors, your communications, how you interact with others. And that becomes important to really understand, am I truly aligned in where I think I am, and how I show up when interacting and engaging with others and differences.
Well, I think there's always going to be also, even though I may be coming from, and I'm going to talk personally here for a second, I apologize, but I can only talk from my perspective. I can't talk from other people's perspectives. I mean, I'd like to think I'm coming from a growth perspective, but I think there's always going to be a certain level of fear perspective in there, because I'm always fearful of the words coming out of my mouth. And if I'm going to say something unintentional, but that comes out wrong.
Absolutely.
And how do I deal with that?
And that's a great place. That's where the growth actually takes place. You can state your intentions. I don't know everything. I'm in the process of learning, and I'm curious, right? And it's how you frame it to engage makes a big difference.
Okay, that's good. So I know we've talked a little bit about policies. We've talked a little bit about culture and things like that. How do we get so again, I have an office. I've got many different people working for me. You know, I want to create the right atmosphere. I want to put in place the right hiring policies and stuff like that. But you said people are looking at things from the outside. I am who I am right now. I'm not who I'm going to be 10 years from now. How do I get from where I am today, where someone looks at me, looks at my website, looks at everything in terms of who's here today, and how do I kind of create that, not necessarily vision. I mean, how do I create the incentives or the, I'm trying to find the right words, sorry, to get people to you know, diverse people to come here, and to be part of, you know, the team here, and to bring the different perspectives to the firm that are necessary for the firm to continue to grow.
Got it. I would say in terms of listen, we're operating right now in a virtual world, right? So it's kind of everything we're in 4 boxes. I see you in a Zoom box. I'm going to be interviewing probably through another Zoom box. How am I going to get to know and connect to me as a potential employee for your organization, right? What's your true purpose? People want purpose. People want a sense of belonging and being connected to their the culture piece. And so I think it comes through also in terms of, I know Deloitte has these 6 characteristics of leadership and inclusive culture traits that you look at, right? Are you coming from a place of, say, like from a curiosity perspective, and really asking and engaging others as part of the conversation, but also how are you utilizing the people within the organization to be your ambassadors for what's really happening in that lived experience? Because they're going to go to them if they know them and connect and say, hey, what's the experience really like here, right? Do you enjoy it, or is it just another job that you're just checking in and checking out for? So that's one way. Also looking at it in terms of what things are you doing in terms of engagement and activities are you putting on in terms of the different celebrations of diversity? How are you doing that? Some people are calling out for innovation, for example, but then when you look at how you're doing innovation, not one piece is considered diversity as part of the design process. And that becomes important because there you've lost the intentionality around innovation, creativity, and bringing people in, and it's part of that process. What products and services are you putting out, and what's the impact? Who is in your commercials, for example, and who you're speaking to, and how you're engaging them? So everything that you do, even though they were looking at you in 4 boxes, we're looking outside too in terms of what is that lived experience? Am I going to like it here? Am I going to enjoy it here? Am I going to be valued, right? And I'm going to be able to be heard and to contribute to this, because no one wants to come into an organization and be stagnant. That's not why anybody wants to come here. And if they are, well, I don't know what that means. But I know for a fact that we all want to grow, we all want to learn, but we also want to feel valued and respected as part of that process.
So how does all of this change with people working more remotely and people not really coming into an office or into a workplace as often as they have in the past? And maybe you don't necessarily have the ability to generate the culture that you would have in the past.
Yeah, I think really, I don't know if you have like a people culture person now that every team and company, I think wholeheartedly needs, because it's really a part of looking at it from what is our culture? Do we even have a culture? Is it really important? But people still want a sense of belonging. We're social beings, right? At the end of the day, we are social beings. And so it becomes really important to look at it from that perspective of the engagement. When you bring someone on, don't leave them to their own devices, right? Check in with them. Connect them with someone across the organization, maybe someone more senior that they can learn from, someone in their own peer group that they can also learn from, and to build that sense of community as part of it. It's really around a community building piece that goes along with this business piece that we're really talking about in a different way. And so that's why I think it doesn't take one person. You can't slap it on HR and say it's yours. No, it's going to be very collective across the organization, and everyone has to understand what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, and how we need to help each other as part of this relationship.
Yeah, and again, I think some of that comes from the leadership that exists within the organization. So what can leaders do to help foster that inclusion, to help kind of create the right environment within a workplace?
Well, I think having these trainings are one way through which to foster learning, right? In terms of helping that. But I think also, how are we holding, what accountability structures are you putting in place for yourselves, right? How are you holding yourselves accountable as part of that? How are you communicating diversity, equity, inclusion? And is it being done regularly? How are you connecting it to the business strategy? Meaning business strategy and operations, you just talk about it in one meeting, and then DEI, someone else takes over, right? Or is it more integrated as part of that? And so thinking through in terms of how you're relating diversity, equity, inclusion as part of your organization becomes important, and telling, informing the rest of the organization how they should be responding and how they should actually be taking this as part of the experience.
So in terms of, you brought up accountability, communication, connection, all that stuff. Do you have any examples or ideas or things that people should be using in terms of, because you're talking about in kind of nebulous thoughts now, and I kind of see if we can get a little more granular?
Let's get granular. So when we're talking about it from the perspective of, for example, I've seen where leadership says, oh, DEI is not me. We have a group here who handles it, but there's no accountability for this group. They have no strategy. They're not doing things consistently, nor regularly, but leadership says, hey, this is the group that handles it, right? So you can tell right from there, as you walk into that organization, that people are not necessarily committed. It's not valued, right? And how am I going to be treated as part of this? What I'm saying is that if you have HR being your DEI person, that's not necessarily maybe the right person to be handling this. This is a total group organization, and leadership has to be involved as part of this conversation. They have to be at the table talking about diversity, equity, inclusion. They have to share the communications and be transparent about what's happening, where we are, because you mentioned, I may not have all the diverse groups in the room, but I want to get there. Tell them that. Share that with them in terms of that vision, and bring them along as part of this, because that becomes important as part of the communication and how you value diversity, equity, inclusion as part of your organization. right? And so when you think from the hiring, some people say talent acquisition, oh, we go and we tell them what they do, but they never bring back the people that we want. How are you holding that group accountable to the acquisition, the attraction, the recruitment of diverse populations? Where are you going for diverse populations? Are it the same relationships that you currently have? Or are you willing to stretch and look and see what other new relationships need to be forged within the community, across the country, across different aspects of the cities? So those are some things that I'm thinking about as part of the overall policies that needs to be unpacked.
So basically what you're saying is people shouldn't just talk the talk, they gotta walk the talk too.
It has to be aligned. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
In terms of kind of creating this proper atmosphere, culture, whatever, air. I kind of like that. I kind of like the way that it kind of makes a whole lot of sense in terms of air. That's my new word now in terms of this whole aspect here. Should we be creating a committee to look at this? I understand leadership has to be at the table as part of that committee, but is it creating a committee, bringing diverse people together so that we can really understand what we need to do internally to kind of set the course as to where we're going as an organization?
I believe that having a committee is part of it, right? Because they're going to be the ones socializing, influencing, and ensuring the strategy is being held and accountable, and the reporting pieces of it. That becomes very important. But I also caution, because you don't want to have all leadership sitting at the team talking to each other when they at the same time. So it's really balanced to make sure that you have a cross-functional groups, across different leaders. If you're more geographically based, that those representations are there as well. And so that way you have a really nice mix of perspectives that are talking about it, doing it, actioning it, as well as can help you scale it.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't necessarily referring that leadership. I said leadership should be at the table. I wasn't necessarily saying the committee should be. I think you need to have some of the younger people within the organization too, some of the line people who are out there in the communities, because they have a good grip on, who's being served, who their customer base looks like. All of those things are going to be very, very important in terms of the process, because as you said, it's not just internally facing, it's externally facing too.
Absolutely. Yeah, when you hear things like if you a community-based organization and their constituents are asking, well, do I belong there? Am I accepted? Can I go in? So there's a huge disconnect in terms of how you're engaging with those emerging populations that you may not have engaged with prior to, right? And so really thinking through, are the services that we have, are they still applicable, right? What's missing? Who's engaging? How are they engaging? And getting really curious and looking at that value chain of the connections that you're having internally as well as externally with your constituents.
That's actually a good thought in terms of even just looking at what are my products, what are the services I'm delivering, and do they meet the populations that fit within our community and within our customer base?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It becomes really important, because now people are saying, are you talking at me, or are you engaging me? And do you understand me, right? Do you see me? And see, those are the types of things that people are talking about. I remember being I've used my backgrounds from the pharma world and sitting on the marketing teams and things of that nature, and forcing the teams to look at how we're communicating. Is it really truly inclusive communications? Who's being represented? Is it of the therapeutic areas that we're working with? How are we communicating it to the people who are treating them, the healthcare practitioners? Do they understand what it might look like within these populations? And so that's when I'm talking about thinking about the design, really thinking it through from every element of not just looking at the masses, but also looking at who else are being impacted, who else is being impacted by your services and products that are being overlooked.
So that brings up the next question. If I'm sitting here and I'm trying to take my next step, and I've got all of these things I have to think about. Do I take this step? Do I think about them all? Do I get caught up in not doing anything because of going back to your fear?
I say, if you standing on the lines is fear, right? You have to, this is something where you have to engage and embrace. But you also have the mindset too, that if we're failing, we're going to be failing forward, we're failing together, and we're failing to learn together, right? So if you have that mindset that, oh my gosh, I'm saying the wrong thing, how about, oh my gosh, I may not know everything and I need to listen more, and I have just a few questions I want to ask you. Really? That's a different way of engaging, right? But also thinking through too, if you feel that you, oh my gosh, it's burning a need, I have to do something, do something. Read, if that's where you want to start doing. Start listening to different perspectives, jumping on some webinars where you have different perspectives speaking and hearing their lived experiences, engaging with others, and not just superficially, hi, how are you, the day's nice, but really consistently, so the layers and onions get peeled. And you can really get to the core of who we are as human beings. And you're not seeing people just as one dimensionally, but more three-dimensionally, right? In terms of who we are.
So it's basically kind of figuring out what we don't know and trying to educate us about it.
But take a step. Don't sit on the sidelines.
You talked before about training, and that training is a good first step in this whole process. What sort of training? Where do people get that training? How does all that work?
Sure. Trainings are a great place if you want to align the organization and to diversity, inclusion, the commonalities of what it is, etc. Right? And there's so many things available out there in terms of reading materials. There are things on there on LinkedIn that you can do. But one of the things that we like to do too is a cultural competency assessment, where it helps the leaders, especially if they're forging into this strategy, to really assess where they are in their journey, and helps also collectively look at where we are as a group. So that way we know what we might need to do to move forward and to start working and mobilizing in this space. But then you also have it collectively where we are and how the decisions are made. Policies get written out, designs and products and services are be created. And so you get more intentionality of who is included, who's not included, what are we missing? And really alerts us to those blind spots or dead angles that we have that we may not even have been privy to prior to taking that assessment.
You talked about having that intentional conversations and starting, and maybe you trip and fall a little bit during this process, but as long as you're moving in an appropriate way. I mean, is there a safe space that gets created for conversation so that people understand that, that's the space where the learning takes place as opposed to people take offense?
In the trainings, absolutely, you can create those safe spaces. And also, but I'd like to say how we create the safe spaces in the trainings can also take some framework of to where we can have those safe spaces outside of that within your individual teams, right? And so putting those rules of engagement of how we're going to speak, how we're going to engage, but also knowing that if I share something, I'm not going to have some negative repercussions come to me either. And so, but it's through consistency. You can't do it once and then it doesn't go and it goes away, because then you're telling people, is it really safe or am I not safe, right? So there are opportunities within the trainings to create that safety and to hear others' lived experiences within the organization, within the culture, and within the constituents and customers that you are engaging with as part of that process.
I was going to say, I think those concerns, though, come from both sides. I think those concerns come from, the employee with leadership and leadership with the employee, and it's kind of a two-way street for that safe space to happen, because both sides have to feel comfortable in that conversation.
Well, the leader has to take that example, right? To say that you can say these things and it's okay, and I will not have a negative reaction to it. But the leader drives that and creates that space, believe it or not, to make the others feel comfortable doing it. Because I've sat in rooms where the CEO is talking, he has these directors around him, and everyone's like, any questions? And there's silence. The minute he hangs up the phone, oh, it's not going to work. Oh, I can tell you, Milne. And they had the opportunity, but they didn't feel safe. They had the opportunity. And when you're stifling that type of opportunity to engage in an open, honest, transparent way, think about the innovation that's being stifled, right? Creativity that's being stifled, collaboration that's being stifled.
Okay. We do have a question. Can you weigh in on employees using their own social media and stating things that are contrary to the DEI efforts of their employer? Kind of the First Amendment sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a tough one. So basically the companies are putting out their own social media pieces, and are they commenting on the company?
No, it's employees who within their social media may be having a contrary position to the DEI efforts of the employer. And obviously, what does that do and how does that work?
Yeah, I take the stance also when you go in Glassdoor, right? And they talk about the companies in terms of their experience, inclusion, diversity, and those things are actually ranked, and they're talking about it. It's an opportunity for you to investigate, right? I wouldn't ignore. But if there are contrary things that you can put out there in terms of other things that you're doing to support your diversity and inclusion efforts, absolutely. But Glassdoor is rampant for sharing. You get honest opinions of past employees sharing contrary things that are taking place within the organization. But the organizations, I say, don't ignore it because they're speaking a truth of theirs of some sorts.
Right. So obviously, I think everybody's feeling somewhat of the tightening of the labor market. And the labor market isn't where it was a few years back. So I think the employers are more open now to maybe look differently than they have in the past in terms of individuals with disabilities and different groups that maybe in the past, because of different reasons, they weren't looked at as closely. What should employers be doing? You mentioned that employers maybe need to look at different spaces than they've looked at in the past. Where can they go? How do they go about that process of exploring other avenues or exploring other spaces that maybe they haven't looked at in the past?
Sure. When you're talking about building more diversity, you're looking at it from graduate schools, right? You have the HBCUs that you can attend to. You have the abilities groups also. You have the Latinx MBA programs that you can look at as part of that piece. You even have the schools, because think about it too. Let's just step back a bit, right? We got here for a certain reason. And there's so many professions that are just people are not aware of, especially at that lower level spaces. So what can we, and I say lower level, the elementary schools, the high schools, even entering into colleges are not aware of certain professions.
Yeah, well, not many people at 6 and 7 years old say, I want to grow up and be an accountant. Sorry. It's just not the.
But if you engage them in a certain way, because they are having conversations about career, believe it or not, and if they're not aware of these different careers, it's not an opportunity for them to even think about it, engage in it, or even inquire around it. So how can you even connect at that level those types of programs to build that awareness? It's a long-term process, but listen, it's a long-term process that we got here, right? That's what I'm talking differently about how we engage with our communities and levels and resources that we can actually provide to build different types of connections. I think of it like a Tide commercial, right? Because the Tide, you remember, if your parents used Tide, you remember that brand. It had a nice fuzzy feeling around it. But just think about how you can actually build that with your companies and those constituents at that young age, and get people excited about who you are and what you do from that perspective. Also, if you do have recruiters that you're utilizing, put that as part of your policies, right? From that perspective of what you're looking for. And if they don't bring what you're looking for, send them back out again. Right? Because that's just how things are and how you want to operate, and what you're telling them is what's important to your organization, to the internally as well as externally. I think too, if you're looking at suppliers and looking at vendors you're working with, have some clause in your contracts where it states explicitly that how you treat our clients, how you treat our employees around diversity and inclusion is important to us, right? So even having that clause in there, because you're holding them accountable to how they're going to engage with your employees, but also how are they engaging with their employees too. So that way, that if there's some sort of accountability piece built into the relationship.
Right. Someone asked, I hear a lot of people say frequently, we want to make better steps, do more, build more, but how do we do it? Where can we find the resources? So, I mean, where do people, I mean, people, so the question is basically saying, you know, we want to take the right steps. We want to do this. We want to be able to incorporate more or build diversity, equity, and inclusion into our culture. How do we do it? Where can we find the resources to be able to kind of build that into and make that part of who we are? Where do the resources come from?
Well, there's so many things out there right now too. I mean, there are a lot. You have the ISO standards that just recently passed that talks about all these different layers of the organization, from the board of directors to talent management, supplier diversity, to employee retention, those types of and HR functionalities and things of that nature. You have it from your vision, your mission, your strategies. Does it incorporate diversity, equity, inclusion? Start there and look at that too. Your value statements, right? Do you even have a diversity, equity, inclusion statement, right? As part of that. Then it goes into leadership. How are they holding themselves accountable? What type of equitable things in terms of, have you done a gender equity salary assessment across your organization? Have you looked at that? So there are many different ways through which to embed the diversity, equity, inclusion to start. But I will say, start with what are you communicating, right? Start with what are we doing, right? And start with also, how are we engaging our employees as part of this this journey, right? From that perspective, because as someone mentioned, our employees are saying X, Y's, and Z's, but we're doing this. Is that, well, what are they experiencing? Have you gotten curious to find out where the breakdowns might be happening, and look and see how we can actually work to repair if there's a breakdown as part of that messaging, as well as part of the behaviors that are being exemplified.
On top of that, if they need outside help, they can just call you, right?
They can call me. Absolutely.
Yeah, and we'll be passing around your when we send around a videotape of this, we'll be sending around your information too, so people can have access to you. And you said that, you know, from a policy perspective, you're creating policies. How do you share those with the outside world, the policies that you're creating? I mean, I assume you shouldn't keep them internal. Those should be shared with the outside world. So how do you recommend sharing the policies that we're creating through this process, and the narratives and the, you know, the culture? How do we share that with the outside world?
Absolutely. There's so many ways through which to share what you're doing, because you mentioned, oh, we're only here. Share that. We're here, but this is where we want to go. I would say Glassdoor, if you're on Glassdoor, because that's where a lot of your talent, they're looking. I would say even on your website as well as part of that too. And I'm not saying hide it just only within the career section. Maybe put a people culture section, and you're sharing that information of what's happening within the culture. Annual report around DEI. What's your state? What's your vision around it too? Social media, right? Because that's, everyone's getting their information and news, and that's the first place people are looking at, the digital footprint, and typing in diversity, equity, inclusion dash company, right, around that. So there are many myriads of ways through which to communicate this, but as long as you're communicating it, I think that's really where the open, honest, and transparency, and it holds the organization accountable too, as part of that in this journey, and their engagement to share and want to ensure that it's a success.
We're running low on time. Do you have any closing comments or anything you want to kind of throw out there before we wrap up?
Yeah, I would say, don't be performative in the space of diversity, equity, inclusion, right? That's not sustainable. And especially a lot of us within organizations that are doing this great work and have these great missions to help the communities in which we serve. Companies, we need to have a systematic and business-led approach to DEI, and you identify those bold steps that will help strengthen your diversity, equity, inclusion, and your people culture strategy together.
Awesome. I can tell you that I got a lot out of this conversation, which means I'm sure everybody else got a lot out of this conversation. So thank you, Simone. It was awesome, and really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So join us next month on March 9th, when we'll be joined by Donna Cerini of Moving Forward Strategies to discuss effective leadership, an important component in attracting and retaining staff. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Simone. And we'll see you guys all next month. Take care.